Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Mindrise podcast. I'm your host, Bailey Fruman, psychotherapist, coach, author of Own Your Power, as well as founder at Mindrise. Today, we are going to be talking about exploring and understanding our feelings, our internal landscape with Dr. Kaveh Kavoosi. Kaveh has been an ER doctor for 3.5 years. However, his work extends far beyond just medical practice. As a world traveler, student of internal family systems, and a dedicated knowledge seeker of the inner workings of the human psyche, Kaveh brings solace, perspective, and much needed compassion to the medical profession. There is a dialogue happening at all times within us that provides insight, depth, and understanding to why our lives, actions, habits, and patterns are the way that they are. And in getting to know them, we can bring more compassion to ourselves and the world around us while coming to harmony in a space where we are less reactive, more responsive, and aware. Ultimately, more love encompasses and drives our lives. So I invite you to dive in and join me in this conversation with Kaveh as we explore and understand our internal landscape. Be sure to subscribe to the Mindrise podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. So big thanks to Kaveh Kavoosi for joining us today. We have Kaveh on today's episode on exploring and understanding our internal language, and we're going to be looking at that through the framework of internal family systems. So that might not sound like it means anything to you. Kaveh is going to help to turn that into English for us so we can understand not only intellectualize it, but also actualize it into our life. So Kaveh, thank you for being on with us, of course.
Thank you for having me, Bailey.
Absolutely. So we'll dive right in because I know that you have been an ER doctor for a few years now, but your work when it comes to healing, extends far beyond just medical practice. You've been seeking knowledge on the inner workings of the human psyche for a long time, especially through internal family systems. So what brought you to this pathway of healing through medicine as well as the mind?
Right. Well, I had a tumor in my neck when I was 20, and I felt that a lot of the subsequent symptoms that I'd experienced as a result of anxiety and panic attacks from me not addressing the fears that came with that diagnosis were so profound. And the therapy models that were available to me and popularized and almost present almost all across society were more coping-based mechanisms as opposed to things that truly went in to resolve the angst that I had. So I felt like I had a temporary place of refuge away from the feelings, and that was okay for a certain while, but I didn't feel like, one, I had quality contact with myself again. I felt like I had created just layers of protection that were effective at their time, but also making me miss a lot of the feelings that life has available to us. And one of the defining things was I was in Iceland about 7 years after having had this tumor, still feeling relatively numb, probably as a result of medicine and residency really burning me out. But I was in one of the most beautiful landscapes that the world offers in its varieties. And I was like, wow, I'm not even able to be present in awareness of where I am right now because I don't feel like I have quality contact with something within myself. And so this train started unraveling where I got curious about, okay, the feelings that I had that were very debilitating and challenging for me at that time, I feel like they were addressed. But when I define addressing, was it something that made me have more quality contact with myself? And as I was asking this question, I'm looking to the right of the room where I'm working as an ER doctor now, and I'm seeing that a lot of people are coming in with mental health issues and concerns. I don't want to say issues. And they're having mental health experiences that have them questioning thoughts of suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, bipolarism, schizophrenia, all these medical conditions that I start realizing every therapy that we offer to them, it seems to be a Band-Aid solution. And so I got curious first for myself, but for them, what could invite something that can invite actionable change for them to have greater quality of contact with who they are and the diagnoses that they had. And internal family systems came into my life, and it was almost like it answered the question that I had been looking for 7 years.
Wow. 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 I, it's so interesting because there often is that like catalyst. Sometimes it's physical, but you're making a good point. Often it's also mental. And it's so interesting how, and I'm sure you could wax lyrical on this one, how something that is actually our mental health or spiritual health can often show up in psychosomatic symptoms within our body, right? And people
Yeah,
often, at least from conversations I have, it is stress or it's anxiety or it's like sleeplessness. But those things over time, they have to be manifesting themselves into bigger physical impact.
right. Right. Well, I think the way that society and its well intentioned to say don't forget things has us holding on to things as opposed to letting us feel through it. And so the mind is wired to have thoughts, not hold thoughts. And an extension of that is our body is meant to have experiences, not hold experiences.
Right.
But the
Right.
way
Right.
that we, like a dog or an animal, will shake off something was traumatic, a human being has a higher likelihood of retaining it. And in that retention, there's a desire for the body almost communicating with our mind to say, please address me, hold me for the thing that I was uncomfortable with.
Right.
But because the language and the invitation isn't there, we escape from our body into this place that we can rationalize and create a story that surrounds us from re-experiencing that thing. And that can extend an entire lifetime. But what is so beautiful is life humbles us in these ways where when our health is confronted again, the layers that we have that protect us from experiencing those bodily symptoms that are yearning for us to feel through and that we may think we're going to die from re-experiencing, it's usually felt, but felt through and then released. And we're able to come back in making like a qualitative contact with our life experience through having resolved or actually just held space for that part of ourself that wants to be seen, heard, acknowledged, understood for the moment at that time.
Right.
And
Right.
then we
Right.
can come back down from here to the body. So go ahead.
No, no, no. So you make a good point of the things that we hold on to. And like, why do we hold on to those? Why do we hold on
Yeah.
to? I mean, many times I think that it's like we hold on to it because if I can catalog this in my mind, then I can possibly prevent it from happening again, possibly prevent it from showing up again. But why do we hold on to things? Why aren't we having a better ability to let go? And where do we learn this or where do we
Mm-hmm.
not learn this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this comes down to our dance that we have with the obligations, expectations, and conditioning that even though well-intended, society, parents, religion, and us, we all take upon ourselves on how we need to show up in the world. And when we need to show up a certain way, our mind says, in order for me to survive this moment, this experience, I need to meet these demands or whatever it may be. And so we're always scanning the horizon, scanning the experience, scanning even poems that people share for like, how do I identify and recognize this? And what does it mean to me? And does it threaten my survival? So these points of reference are always placed everywhere for what we say is the ego. But the ego is this beautiful construct that embeds a lot of our aspects of how we protect ourselves in order to come back to presence. And if we're not safe or deemed to be safe as we define it, presence is not going to be available to us. And so we hold on to things because these are our strongholds to define survival over thriving. Because we can live our entire life without having felt any playfulness, joy, curiosity, or anything that has us thriving as and just survive until the last moment that we're alive, and that be okay for our system because our body always prioritizes survival, and so these checkpoints are there for that reason.
Right, right, right. And you make a good point because I think that ego's gotten a bad rap, right? It's always
Yeah.
been billed as like, oh, that person, they've got a big ego. Like, where do we develop a healthy relationship with our ego? Because at
Yeah.
least I'm not picking it up in our cultural messaging as being something that we are embracing.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it ties in IFS greatly here as subject matter that intertwines. And so in internal family systems, like how they define it is we are multiplicity. We are multiple parts. We are all multiple personalities, if you want to call it that. But there's multiple parts of us that are existing at all the same time. So if people want to say they live like multiple lives, there is some validity to it, because we have a conscious process, subconscious, unconscious, and then the witnessing position. And with internal system, this recognizes that we all have these parts that exist in these natural states. And then when these natural states experience a trauma or an attachment injury or something that it perceives to have been a threat to itself, it responds with some type of mode of compensation, either behaviorally, ideologically, actionably, and the places that it goes to as a form of protection in the name of survival. And these things that we do to protect ourselves end up being these things reinforced within ourselves. So if it was a moment that we felt lacking intelligence, where we felt stupid, and someone, especially that mattered to us, charges us, so there's like an energy load that's even higher of us feeling the stupidity in addition to being witnessed as stupid, we have a higher likelihood of protecting ourselves from ever feeling stupid again, if the word is stupid. So then our intelligence heightens. And our intelligence can sometimes ramp up. And in those moments that someone challenges your intelligence, or your intelligence isn't able to be shining for some reason or seen, you may feel like you're not able to identify with yourself, and you may feel like you're vulnerable, almost like you're dying. But all it is a protective mechanism. And so the ego is the culmination of all of the ways that we have innately, biologically, societally, and socially learned to adapt to protect ourselves. And it's these mechanisms in there. And what's beautiful with internal family systems is it gives verbiage, words for you to understand what these are. So if you have a trauma, internal family systems identifies these things called protectors. So they're the protector mechanisms that you have. And these protector mechanisms show up in different arenas, like maybe at work is different than with your friends versus when you're among a bunch of people in prison. And so they're managed by managers. And then we have these extinguishing tools that we have within us from if the pain of the trauma is ever coming back out, or it's being brought up, someone's triggering you, you're being triggered by life, you're being challenged by it. We have these firefighters, which are these tools that we have to extinguish pain rapidly. And most people have very fine-tuned tools for extinguishing pain when they're not feeling well. But the problem is a lot of those, not problem, but issue is that society pathologizes a lot of the tools that we use to extinguish pain. So if someone drinks alcohol, which is a medicine to extinguish the sensation of an discomfort, it's pathologized as being an alcoholic, an alcoholism. And so the person has a lot of shame in all of the firefighter traits for the most part, especially if they're seen by the world. But the 6 most common firefighters are alcoholism. So alcohol, drugs, gambling, sex, working harder, and sleep, which are all tools for what we would define as escaping, but it's also medicine from overwhelm, of us not being ready to deal with that part of us that's hurt. And so internal family systems creates this and invites you to this way to navigate yourself, almost like Google Maps, to navigate when I'm feeling this, it might be this part that's coming up. And where I'm feeling burden on my system, I can actually have more actionability and recognizing how to navigate through it. And yes, it does involve you being in here, but through the rationalization and understanding, we're able to come to a place where we understand and why this story is expressing this way, and come back and feel the expression of it, and come back to a greater merging of mind and body, where there's a massive disconnect right now. And internal family systems ultimately allows you to not just have to cope your way through life, but unburden it.
Right. Oh, you're getting attacked.
Yeah, I am.
Okay. Well, so I hear you in this, and I think that that you're right. It's about that ability to unburden ourselves, because I think what you're right that we do is we carry our backpack with all of our cinder blocks, right? Maybe that's all of our parts or all of our traumas or whatever our shit is, right? And I guess maybe even in internal family systems, it's not seen as a positive or a negative, but let's just say we've got a backpack full of cinder blocks and we can cope with it, right? We could just hold our breath and keep on trudging, as opposed to having a methodology with which we can unpack that backpack.
Yeah,
So
exactly. So
I'm curious, in your work through internal family systems, how does it allow you to find those pathways of healing? right? Rather than numbing, which we all do. Is it a matter of like we identify it, and then what's the pathway to healing?
Well, as we had been speaking before, because we have so many layers packed upon us, when we can create buffers for us to contemplate the life that we're having, contemplate the way people are existing, contemplate the life that we have the opportunity for. Internal family systems creates that space for it. It's starting to rain, so I'm like, oh my god, technology. So and when we gain the terminology to have quality contact with the parts of us that are usually the most fearful and the most burdening on our life, anytime you're able to remove the sack for ourselves, it's really potent. But very often what ends up being the case is you have greater humility and compassion for how the rest of the world is burdened with themselves as well too, because the majority of our triggers that we see from the world are bringing us back to ourselves every time. But our overlying tendency is to place blame on others and put the responsibility on others to make us feel a different way. But with IFS, you rapidly reclaim the capacity that, oh, I see that, but this is what it's bringing up within me. And oh, now even further, I feel actionability with my capacity to navigate that specific thing. And what's on the other side of the navigation is this reclamation of this energy that they call self, which is this ever-loving, all patient, compassionate energy that exists within us, that gentle being behind and within even the most hardened narcissist, if we were to even say that narcissism is a thing. And so, this is already even a terminology that if we were to break down and decorticate what narcissism is, we use it as a pillar to understand and identify a person. But often that generalization that we do burdens them to the title that we've put them on. And that can ultimately end up being a disservice to them, because they're like, yeah, I'm a narcissist. That's how the world sees me. And so I will be this way. Whereas maybe they just wanted to be held by their mother, and because they weren't seen, they doubled down. And oh, now we can work back.
Right. You nailed it. And I think that whether it's narcissism or some other label, that's also part of the mental and emotional journey that I think could be readdressed within our society, is the fact that many times when we throw a label on things, which I understand that we need to have some categories and classify things, especially if you're following like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. But a lot of times we live up to those labels. We live up to those expectations. Oh, Johnny has oppositional defiant disorder. That's why he is. So it's like, did you write a prescription for who this person is to show up as? And in my mind, that knocks out some opportunities to look at the parts of them. I mean, every narcissist or, self-proclaimed or pointed at as narcissist that I've ever experienced, you know what I came down to is I saw someone who was insecure. And then we develop all these mechanisms of protection and, ways to soothe ourselves or ways to stay safe, or the illusion of safety. Really, it's just somebody who's really sad.
And we can all do there's an opportunity for us to navigate first the identities that we carry that others have bestowed upon us. Because even in heated dialogues, for example, people will be like, you're being a blank versus you are a blank. Sometimes in the terminology, we just say you are and then the person is burdened to carry that thing, as opposed to like, you're being a whiny person versus you're a whiny person. The differentiation is small, but it's very potent to how our body processes it. And I'll give you an example is that when I'm at the hospital, I have my tag on here and I ask people, I say, am I a doctor? And they're like, yeah. I said, no, I'm not. It's what I do, not who I am. And they start recognizing differentiation. In the same light, I'll say, the diagnosis that you have here, what is your past medical history? I have anxiety, I have depression, I have bipolarism. I said, how about as an alternative, we say, I'm experiencing anxiety, I'm experiencing depression, and I'm experiencing bipolarism. And then all of these then I go in further to mention to them that the DSM, which is this well-intended book from psychiatry that has this classification of all these terms that we give to people, are all like these words that have pathologized people when they're actually adaptations and coping mechanisms to experiences that traumas or attachment injuries cause, which is interestingly what IFS comes back to. So in the reclamation of this, recognizing that these are maladaptations that we are defining as words, all of them are, because I said maladaptation, adaptable. So every single diagnosis that any human being has is always adaptable. Yes,
Right.
there's other ones that are a bit more permanent, like paralysis and things like that. But even in there's some level of reclamation that's there. But when we leave this blanket statement that generalizes, especially the identity, our ego that is so fine-tuned to find points of reference for it to understand where it is in space and the environment and the people that it is, will just be satiated in that diagnosis, but also
Sure.
crushed too.
Right. Right. No, I think you're entirely correct. So what I'm curious about is like, where are we, or where are we not taking into account trauma response? Right. So
Mhm.
I remember, I mean, years ago, but 6 years ago, I was in a car accident where the brake line absolutely failed. And and thankfully I was parked, but my car, when shifting it, slammed into the car in front of me, slammed into the car in back of me, and I felt completely out of control. And so I had that trauma response experience. So this is pretty easy to understand. Like in the future, when I'm in a car, especially if I'm not driving, someone slams on their brakes, like my whole body goes into this place of shock. So one could say I could walk into a psychiatrist's office and they say, oh, you have an anxiety disorder, right? Based on, wanting to follow through with the classifications that exist in the DSM. But it's like, well, hold on a second. Like that is an experience of a trauma response.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious from your perspective, like how much goes into, being in a state of trauma and responding to the trauma and adapting from those previous experiences or labels, and to how we show up in today, especially when it relates to our pathways of healing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad that trauma is having the acknowledgement that it is progressively more and more. I mean, thinking that soldiers in the Second War, I believe in First War, were deemed like it's called war neurosis, and they were shell shocked, were killed for not going back to war because it was seen as them like some form of weakness, when they were truly experiencing post-traumatic stress related to the war. And we can imagine how profound that is, like to the level when you see another human being being killed, you going and experiencing all of the atrocities associated with war. That downstream effect of trauma, like lack of acknowledgement, just speaks to how far we have come, but how far we have still to go to recognize and have better work, like how we can work better with the biological ingraining that trauma does on us. Because I mean, our forefathers, our predecessors didn't have high impact vehicles that are 2 tons at 130 kilometers an hour, or like 80, 90 miles an hour, and smashes into things. And not only do we potentially have that experience ourselves, where we can have a systematic failure at this high speed that our biology hasn't adapted to, but also we have been smashed over and over again with the conditioning when we see car accidents on media or we hear about it from people, to have this priming of our traumatic response and our the sympathetic response to trauma if we were to have it, which brings us probably to be more vigilant when we're driving, but also more primed for a trauma to embed ourselves. And when trauma does happen, it's pretty beautiful to see how our body already has some defense mechanisms programmed in it, where people have amnesia, where their memory is not there. It's so traumatic that our brain cuts out memory of the experience, where it creates numbness because the pain is so debilitating. But what I think we fall short of, and I hope we can invite more in, is this unspoken of uncertainty for the amount of time that's required for you to feel through that experience and have the space to actually make through it. Because we'll have a car accident and I expect to be at the office on Monday. How is that possible for us to for it to be okay? But it may not be the office. It may just be, I had a traumatic experience where my boss yelled at me and now I have to go home and see my children and be very happy and all this stuff, when I didn't have the opportunity to process through my things. So it comes back to us maybe recognizing that we don't have all the answers to know right now what the best ways to navigate it, but it sure as heck is better addressed when we make space for it in the first place and invite the discussion that can involve and incorporate more tools that have us understand ourselves through the traumatic experience that we have, and not be fearful of life necessarily without having had the opportunity to navigate through it.
Right. And that makes sense. So I guess what I'm curious about, at Mindrise, like we talk about mastering your mindset. We talk about raising your awareness so that you can you create that game plan and achieve your goals and step out of being in your own way. So I'm curious for you, Kaveh, like what was so far in your journey, and what was one of your biggest fears, and how did you overcome it?
Well, again, I think it comes back to the tumor, where I'm interestingly, how the world brings it back is the lesson is brought up every time in the ER. So I may have chosen this job unconsciously knowing it, job vocation. But when I had my tumor, I felt fearful of life being stripped away from me and not being wanted by this world. And what that did was created mechanisms of me being scared to be seen by the world, yet wanting to be seen, held, loved, and reminded that you belong here, as if belonging is a story that you need to have validated. And so unworthiness ensued from that, not wanting to be seen, but wanting to be held, not being loved by this world. So all of those compounded into a fear of being forgotten, isolation that got reiterated through the medical cycle that I went through. And I recognized in reflection that I hadn't been appreciating life until I was confronted with the finiteness of it, that a lot of medical conditions do. And that's more of the lottery ticket than actually winning the lottery. The true lottery is recognition and appreciation of your life, and how people come to that, where they suddenly become more curious and adaptable to all of the opportunities that exist within it. I don't see anything that's more potent than you almost having life stripped away from you. And the tumor was that experience that I had 6 to 8 years of fear that maybe has now 14 years since then. I still have expressions of it show up intermittently, but it invoked curiosity for myself that has allowed awareness, presence, and intentionality to be these things, these pillars that I choose as like wanting to come back to. Because for me to survive includes for me to be, I've invited my mind to say, for me to survive is for me to invite as many possibilities to the presence of life, even if that means horrific pain, lack of understanding, being absolutely crushed. And I think when you give more permission for all of that and your adaptability through it, your ego almost by definition softens into all the more, so many more possibilities. And so if we can invite others to say like, hey, in my imperfection, that is perfect. In my my life that feels like forever, I am finite. And in this chronological time of me being this mortal being, am I really capturing the things of life that I want to like really be understanding more within myself, having greater depth? And is it inviting more quality of contact with the things that I'd actually like to do? And I think the 4 pillars that everyone can be invited into from that is that through that awareness and that story of recognition and reclamation of their fear is presence, intentionality, consciousness, and awareness. And these are 4 words that when you involve them together, they're things that make you really taste life.
Right. Well, it's so interesting because, I was actually talking to a client today, and the word presence and being grounded came up. And I started, talking about being intentional, right? Because I think that in some ways, like we wake up and we're kind of treating our life like on your mark, get set, go. And, when you were telling us the story about, being in Iceland, and it's like just majestic, and realizing like, I am not present to this right now. And even as you said, like your mission now is to be present to it all through the pain or through the joy and all of that. So I'm curious, like, what do you see as some of the tools that we can use to be present, to get grounded in our life, to not just go through life like on your mark, get set, go, but weave in intentionality, that place of consciousness.
If you're saying on your mark, get set, go, the first thing that comes to mind is on your mark, get set, slow. And if we can invite more gentleness and slowness to all of the processes that we have in life, we're already more present to a thing. If you're going to reach for a water bottle, you can reach fast and go and sip, or you can bring your hand in so slowly that it almost makes you frustrated to this thing, and really slowly bring it to your mouth. And it's going to invite you to all of the sensorial things. Like, wait, I recognize the habituation or the automatism of you grabbing this and sipping and then done. But were you really present to the sip? And now in the slowness, that question has the opportunity to present itself. And a process that I've found really effective for us bringing opportunities for greater presence is the acronym I would use would be ECI. So experience, contemplation, and integration. And you may have a bunch of experiences throughout your day, some time for contemplation, and then we have this naturally biological thing called sleep that naturally integrates for us. You don't have to do anything, almost like digestion. You eat your food and your body does the rest. But if we stack too many experiences, just like overeating, we hijack the time that's available for contemplation, and we hijack integration. And if we think how society is wired, we have so many more experiences available to us that we hijack ourselves and almost distract ourselves from things that even make us aware of our biological signals that say, hey, you're starting to get tired, wind down. It's time to sleep, you're fatigued, it's time to reset. Now we have coffee to override that. We have stimulants to override that. We have distractions to override us, and all the signals are missing. This thing is the most potent drug that we all have, and like we're all addicted to this in some way as a substance. And if you don't identify with that, that's beautiful. And if you do, if you're triggered by that, please explore that. But if we are able to create a space where we intentionally say, I've had experiences in life, where am I inviting my time for contemplation, integration? Integration resolves the unconscious and subconscious processing that we have on a thing that allows us to finally come to resolve and have space for presence. Because if we have not figured it out yet or processed through, our brain deems lack of survivability on that thing because it has not been processed. And so if we create more processing time, our body is able to say, I'm resolved now, I'm clear, and now I have more opportunities for presence. And presence is on the other side of all of the stories that we tell ourselves, and if survival has been deemed in that moment to be achieved in that moment. And that's when presence arrives. And I think a lot of people only experience that in things like in fleeting moments, like in intimacy, at the peak of an orgasm, where almost all the stories are overridden for a brief moment. And that may be why the pursuit is so potent for all of us, and why biology has put that at the downstream of why people have life that ensues from that. In the moment of pure presence, we return to paradise, and in that life is able to be recaptured and furthered as well too. Yeah. Maybe that's a little clue from biology itself, that that's where presence is the most potent aspect of life itself.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's so beautiful. And you know, Kaveh, I think you're right. I think that in many ways, and I know I've fallen victim to it plenty of times, or, you know, I don't know if victim is quite the right word, but I've gotten myself caught in the trap of being on the go, so much so that I'm not making any time for contemplation. And it's almost like, hurry up and go to sleep so that you can do the same thing again tomorrow. And when I really examine that pattern that we all have a tendency to fall into, but, you know, owning that for myself, sometimes it's like I am finding myself unwilling to contemplate because I don't really want to look to see what's actually happening in the mirror. So I'm going to keep myself so busy so I don't have to do that. And I mean, I know I'm in good company with that, because I don't know if it's this culture of busy as a badge of honor, or not feeling not creating the space to feel your feelings is almost easier. But I hear what you're saying. We shrink that contemplation and integration time so much so. And so we've got to practice our ECI. Not too much E.
Well, Sorry, yeah. If our output is what we revere one another for, and that is strictly like how you show up in the world, there's a higher tendency to show up for that expression, but at the expense of parts of us. And so our responsibility and opportunity is to like make contact with that part. And it happens through contemplation itself. Just by definition, a check-in is just it makes a little fork in the ground that says, hey, I'm here now and I'm feeling a little exhausted, or I'm feeling unresolved or incomplete on a thing, or I feel like, well, I'm putting a lot too much of too much output. And we'll be able to actually make a space to maybe set up a plan to not have that happen, because our body is so good at inviting more and more adrenaline and things, coping mechanisms in to show up for that output indefinitely. But indefinite doesn't mean effective or sustainable. It's finite, and eventually the person is not able to show up that way. And either life hits you in the face or some type of experience happens that obligates you to be humbled and contemplate eventually. So if we can invite that experience, contemplation, integration a little bit more soon through the act of contemplation itself, I think we're going to be a lot more effective in not feeling like we need to catch up, and as opposed like, and we can be right in line with, or maybe even ahead.
Yeah. I'd be curious from you, what are some of your favorite tools for contemplation? Because for me, I mean, obviously, like, we've got a coaching company, because I think that processing and having conversations and being accountable to that space is a great way for contemplation. Right. But I'd be curious from you, like, what are some of your favorite tools for contemplation?
I have a weekly men's group that I have myself and two other men that we get involved, we communicate. And what's potent about that is in dialoguing about the things that one of our criteria almost is like show up with honesty, but especially with vulnerability. And our vulnerability checkpoint is, if it feels uncomfortable, this is what must be spoken. And usually just in naming it, it diffuses the energy that's associated with our incapacity to address it ourselves or prioritize it, and definitely not name it to other people or show it to other people. But what we recognize very often is, had we not addressed this, this would be spilling into the world in some way and spilling into our lives. So the reclamation of that says, like, it's okay to feel a thing. It's like anger. Like, men, we feel anger. It's okay to understand it, feel it, but it's not okay technically to spill it onto the world. Yet it happens all the time. And so like this ability to process it in a safe space allows that to happen. And I myself, when I wake up, as best I can, I will go find somewhere that is silent and bring a gentle pace to the day that invites a more gentle pace throughout the day too. Because if you wake up and marathon with a coffee and like your phone, you're already setting a threshold for your brain to be on in order to show up that way. And that may be the only place you get to know yourself as. But if we progressively decrease that threshold for stimulation, your mind is allowed to actually have more time to process the experience itself, be present to the experience if possible, contemplate it, and have the checkpoint for the contemplation of the experience to happen before letting another experience happen, and then integrate that too. Sounds boring, but these are the foundational things that allow us to be qualitatively more present to life. And I mean, I'm not practicing what I preach all the time, so this is a reminder for me too.
Yeah, well, and I think like to master is to teach it. Ultimately, one of my favorite practices, well, two of my favorite practices are kind of just a simple one, like just hand to heart and like, hey, how are you? Right? Hey, like, how you doing? Just checking in, because sometimes the hey, how you're doing that happens in the external world, at least in my interpretation, is everyone wants you to say you're doing great so that they can ask you their next question, right? Because that's really what we're many times engaging on. But taking that time for you is also, in my mind, saying, I'm important to me, and I'm not only important when somebody else acknowledges me. And I think that's pretty powerful. The other practice that I don't know if you subscribe to this, but is journaling. And I find that journaling and just taking that time for contemplation is really helpful, but I know it's super intimidating to a lot of people. In fact, we have a 90-day journal that's coming out through Mindrise called the Elevate Journal. And each 30 days, we're looking at, rising, transforming, and leading. And I think that being able to like take that time to journal and look at yourself, that space of contemplation, that's when we really see, there's the pattern. There I am.
Beautiful. I love that you're inviting the space for the journal, because again, it comes back to mind is wired to have thoughts, not hold thoughts.
Right.
And that there's this Emerson Wallace, I think was his name. He said thoughts detangle themselves when they come through the lips or through the pencil tips. And
I like
that's
that.
those two in conjunction together meet the journal as a beautiful opportunity to us to process this thing. And if I were to bring internal family systems back, when you have your hand on your chest, what they would invite you to, they, me, anyone, is check in a quiet space or a place that you can be undistracted. Ask yourself, how are you doing? And wait for an answer. And it's going to be so interesting that there's parts of you that you can be dialoguing with. That's not the way that they invite to navigate through there. But curiously, one of the most beautiful things that has come up through internal family systems is you can actually, without it being psychosis, have a very constructive, logical conversation that may be charged at times with your thoughts, that's what we perceive them as, where they may actually be expressions from parts of you that have been longing for your attention for a while. Right now, while you're showing up for those outputs and the go, they're screaming and yearning for your attention. And so you can check in and just say, like just observe those thoughts in a meditative space, which is just silent witnessing. And if you want, if there's a thought that's more potent, see if you can start engaging with it by letting it know how old you are, asking it how old it is. Very funny questions, I know. But then finally going into the thought and asking it if it has anything that it would like to show you. And without any pressure, expectation, with just curiosity and compassion, see and wait what they say, what these thoughts guide you to. And I invite you to trust what those thoughts are guiding you towards out of curiosity. And if you feel overwhelmed, you can ask other thoughts to step back so you can stay present with one and feel into it. If it shows up somewhere on your body, touch. And it's so interesting how our body has this quality that we can't, this profound intelligence that's navigating through us at all times, while we have this conscious expression to the world that's processing through. And the more time we spend with these things, the more curiosity invoking it is, but we gain a better grasp, a better capacity to navigate through. And so our elevation, like your journal is called, is not on behalf of us getting away from a feeling within us or getting to a new level. It's us profounding our understanding and depth within ourselves. And so our elevation is not a compensation, but an expression of how we have evolved. And I think that differentiation is important because it involves and incorporates my addressing and analysis of my why for why I wanted to elevate in the first place. Because we don't see any journals that are called the regression journal, right?
Right.
Maybe I'll make that.
Right. Next up. So as we wrap up, I've got two more questions for you. The first is what is next for you as you elevate your life?
Yeah. Differentiating my sources of output that are hustle to the grind versus more mission oriented that has the soul intertwined with what my output is. And always setting up these checkpoints that I think have been so potent at me creating barriers. For example, again, being a doctor, a lot of healthcare professionals are pretty exhausted from this pandemic, but not many of them have been invited to a pause. And I saw that I was getting so exhausted in addition to my colleagues. And if we're not being invited to it, what am I waiting for to take a pause myself? And so every 6 months, I invited, as challenging as it is, a 1 month pause. And it's long enough to be uncomfortable, but so potent in its long-term effect. And me being able to be present to it, I think that space from your output allows you to disconnect from that and reconnect with self, because the disconnection from output is a reconnection with self opportunity. Not that it's necessarily claimed, but it makes the space for it. Yeah. And it takes a little bit of time for us to have that. And so that's the hope that I can, not hope, the belief that I can embody more progressively through life and invite others into that possibility too.
I love that. I love that because you're right. I think that when we do go to take our break or take our vacation, we've jammed it with an entire itinerary, which
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily lend itself to the exhale. So yeah, that's a great point. So I maybe that leads right into my final question for you. And like, what is like the last piece of advice that you would give to someone else who is on the path of, inquiry and attaching and connecting to their human psyche and their parts, and they're on their journey? Like, what would be that piece of advice that you would give to someone who's looking to elevate themselves?
Mm. Do regular check-ins as like a point in time to see how curious am I to life right now. Because if I'm feeling rigid or hardened to a certain process, I'm maybe not making contact with the life that I have possible and available to me. And how can I adapt the way that I'm existing or living right now to connect more to the being part of me? And usually, if I were to distill it down into two words, it would be, how can I remain curiously adaptable? And the curious adaptability, when applied to life, makes it so abundantly more playful. Like every ordeal shifts into an adventure. Every hustle shifts into a mission if you allow it to, because you recognize the adaptability and you intentionally step into like this other side of you. And if we remain at like either we set on a calendar these moments where I'm going to do a check-in with myself, or we can invite this in as a ritual. Differentiation between a habit and a ritual is exactly that. The ritual has intentionality to it. A habit is rooted in well-intended automatisms for us to recognize our process in life. So curious adaptability would be how I define that.
Curious adaptability. So that's definitely a writer downer, everybody. Awesome. Kaveh, I can't thank you enough for being on. And I feel like you and I could definitely talk for hours and wax lyrical on the human psyche, because there are so many more layers. Definitely, especially as we are all in the experiential journey every single moment, for sure. So for more conversations from Kaveh, where will we find you on the internets? Where are you hanging out?
Minimally hanging out online because presence is my priority, but drkavoosi.com.
Mm-hmm.
So drkavoosi.com, and then Kaveh Kavoosi on Instagram for now. Who knows where the internet ether will take me after, but for now, those are probably the two best points of reference, but in person is best.
Exactly. Awesome. We'll be sure to throw those links in our show notes, but thank you so much for being with me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Bailey.